Fight to the death. That was the official command from Third Reich propaganda. By 1943, orders to hold out until the last bullet became the standard. Generals demanded absolute self-sacrifice from every soldier. But while the high command preached martyrdom, German engineers were building something different. They designed a machine where the primary superpower was a fast escape. The vehicle featured 12 cylinders and 8 drive wheels. It possessed 2 separate steering wheels. The first was for the driver facing the front. The second was for the radio operator in the rear. If the situation turned hopeless, the operator took control. He steered the vehicle backward without losing a second. It was a unique predator. For this machine, retreat was not a sign of weakness. It was a tactical advantage. The armored car could hit 90 kilometers per hour in reverse. It did not need to turn around under fire. It simply vanished from the battlefield. This is the story of the Puma. It was an armored car too complex for mass production. Its skin was too thin for direct combat. Its price tag was too high for a collapsing economy. It stood as a pinnacle of engineering. But it arrived exactly 3 years too late. Why did Germany build this masterpiece for the African desert when Soviet tanks were already hitting the Reich's borders? At first glance, a strategic blunder, but in reality, a relic of old ambitions. To find the answer, the timeline must move back to 1940. It was a time when Germany believed its technology was invincible. The footage from that era shows massive factories, endless steel, and confident officers. There was no mistake in their eyes. Events accelerated. The plan for a global war required a scout that could see everything and outrun everyone. But the desert for which it was designed was already lost. The sound of heavy engines filled the workshops. There was no turning back. Thus began the development of a machine that would eventually have no country left to defend. Poland and France were victories, but they exposed a massive flaw in German intelligence. The machines meant to lead the way were failing. The 8-wheeled armored cars, the 231 and 232, were the workhorses of the reconnaissance battalions. They were designed for speed. In reality, they could not keep up with the pace of the offensive. The engines were the first problem. These gasoline motors overheated after only a few hours of driving. The chassis was the second problem. These frames were based on commercial trucks. On the rough dirt roads of Poland, they simply fell apart. How did they handle combat? They didn't. The 20mm automatic cannons were too weak. The shells were useless against anything heavier than a light transport. The footage from the front shows the reality. A crew spots enemy positions. The radio operator sends the coordinates. The driver shifts into reverse to escape. Then, the engine stalls. The heat has seized the pistons at the worst possible moment. In other cases, the suspension snaps on a minor bump. Sometimes the commander fires his cannon only to watch the shells bounce off the thick armor of a French tank. The scouts were supposed to be the eyes of the army. Instead, they became targets. They could not fight back, and they could not run away. Many crews died inside stalled vehicles. But this was only the beginning. The German command was already planning the next campaign. The destination was North Africa. This was a boundless desert without roads. In the Sahara, the nearest repair shop could be 500 kilometers away. The daytime heat was extreme. It turned the engine compartments into metal ovens. Standard radiators boiled over in less than 2 hours. The situation was critical. A fundamentally new vehicle was required. It needed to travel 100 kilometers into enemy territory and survive the return trip. There was no room for error. The desert did not forgive mechanical failure. August 1940. The Wehrmacht Armaments Office issued a direct order for a new heavy reconnaissance armored vehicle. The machine had one purpose: survival in the desert. Several companies divided the labor. Buzingnag in Leipzig engineered the chassis. German Noble Steel in Krefeld stamped the armored plates for the hull. But the vehicle needed a specialized engine. This task went to the Czechoslovakian firm Tatra. In the town of Nesseldorf, chief designer Hans Ledwinka read the technical requirements. Many engineers called the assignment impossible. The military demanded an air-cooled diesel engine. It had to function in the 50-degree heat of the Sahara and the -30-degree cold of Russia. There could be no radiator. There could be no liquid cooling system. These were traditional weak points that a single bullet could destroy. Why did the Wehrmacht demand air cooling? Liquid systems leaked, froze, or evaporated in extreme climates. But building a high-power air-cooled diesel was a mechanical nightmare. Ledwinka and his team worked for nearly 2 years. They spent months on cylinder head designs and fan blade angles. The first prototype emerged in the summer of 1942. It was a 12-cylinder V-type diesel engine. The machine produced 220 horsepower. It ran without a drop of coolant. On the test stand, the engine performed perfectly. But there was a flaw. In reality, the engine was a disaster for scouts. The sound was the problem. During field tests, the roar of the cylinders could be heard for kilometers. For a reconnaissance vehicle, silence is a weapon. This machine was supposed to approach enemy lines and vanish without a trace. Instead, the engine announced its presence like a siren. For the crew, this noise was a death sentence. Tatra engineers searched for a way to muffle the vibration and exhaust. They redesigned the cooling fans and added heavy insulation. But time ran out. The war did not wait for technical perfection. In the fall of 1942, the British stopped Rommel's advance at El Alamein. The desert campaign shifted, events accelerated, the demand for the vehicle remained, but the strategic situation changed. The roaring engine now faced a new enemy: time. This was only the beginning of the vehicle's struggle. May 1943. The African Corps surrendered in Tunisia. The desert campaign was over. Germany lost the very territory for which this vehicle was designed. The machine, built specifically for the Sahara, arrived too late for its own war. But the project did not die with the African front. A vehicle with a 1,000-kilometer range was still valuable. The German High Command looked toward the Soviet Union. The vast expanses of the Eastern Front required massive endurance. One problem remained. The new armored vehicle needed a turret and a powerful gun. German factories were overwhelmed. Production lines focused on heavy tanks and urgent repairs. There was no room for a new design. Then, a sudden change in plans. January 1943. Adolf Hitler met with Reich Minister Albert Speer. The Führer made a final decision. He shut down the VK Leopard light reconnaissance tank project. Hitler believed the Panther tank could handle reconnaissance duties. He refused to waste more resources on a specialized light vehicle. The Leopard project stopped instantly. No prototype was ever finished, but the hardware already existed. The turrets were finished and sitting in the factory. Each one featured a 50mm Kw-K39 cannon. This was the same weapon used on the Panzer III. The turrets were functional, they were fully equipped. But the tanks they were built for would never exist. These components were now orphans of a canceled project. The engineers saw an opportunity. It was a perfect match. The project moved forward. Daimler-Benz engineers found a new solution. They took a turret designed for a 26-ton tank and mounted it onto an 11.5-ton armored car. On paper, it looked absurd. In reality, this combination created what historians now call the most perfect armored car of the Second World War. How did they achieve such a balance? The answer lay in the engine. Hans Ledwinka finally solved the noise issue. The modified Tatra 103 engine featured 12 cylinders and produced 220 horsepower. It ran quietly. This was critical for a reconnaissance vehicle that needed to remain undetected. The design used air cooling. This eliminated the need for a radiator. In the Sahara Desert, there was no water to boil. In the Russian winter, there was nothing to freeze. The engine ran on diesel fuel. It was economical. More importantly, it was less flammable than standard gasoline. The footage shows a unique silhouette, but the real innovation was the chassis philosophy. Buzzing Nag engineers designed the frame with 2 full-fledged control stations. The primary driver sat in the front. Behind him, the radio operator occupied a rear-facing seat. This second crew member was also a driver. He sat facing the back of the vehicle with a complete set of controls. The transmission featured 6 forward gears and 6 reverse gears. This mechanical layout served one purpose. The Puma could escape an ambush at full speed in reverse. It did not need to turn around. It did not waste precious seconds exposing its thinner side armor. The mechanics were complex. All 8 wheels were steerable. This gave a massive vehicle maneuverability usually reserved for small cars. The camera captures the wheels turning in unison, allowing the Puma to navigate tight forest tracks and narrow city streets. It was not built for a direct slugfest. It was an instrument for intelligence, but this was only the beginning. The Puma represented a shift in German doctrine. Speed and information became more valuable than heavy plating. Every component served the goal of seeing the enemy first and leaving the area before they could fire back. This was a predator designed for the open road. 85 kilometers per hour. That was the speed. 1,000 kilometers. That was the range. German engineers achieved these numbers by sacrificing everything else. Protection was the first victim. The frontal armor measured 30 millimeters. It could stop small arms fire, but the rest of the vehicle was a shell. The hull sides were 8 millimeters thick. The turret sides were 10 millimeters. This was a critical failure. What did this mean on the battlefield? An American M8 Greyhound armored car carried a 12.7 millimeter Browning machine gun. In combat tests, this machine gun pierced the Puma's side from 500 meters away. Not a cannon, not an anti-tank gun, a machine gun. The Puma was not a true armored car. It was a high-speed engine wrapped in a thin steel skin. One burst of heavy fire turned the interior into a trap of flying metal shards. Production was the second failure. It was too complex. The manufacturing process was split across 5 different cities. The chassis came from Leipzig. The hulls arrived from Krefeld. Berlin and Elbing produced the turrets. The engines traveled all the way from Czechoslovakia. The logistics were a nightmare. Parts moved across a collapsing rail network under constant Allied bombing. Trains were derailed, factories were leveled. The Reich industry could not maintain the schedule. The results were catastrophic. Production lasted from September 1943 to September 1944. In 12 months, the factories delivered only 101 vehicles, 101 Pumas. This was the total supply for every tank division in the entire Wehrmacht. The high-speed Scout had arrived, but there were not enough of them to change the war. The main failure was not the armor or the assembly line. It was the 50-millimeter gun. The K-39 cannon was identical to the weapon mounted on Panzer III medium tanks. It could destroy enemy armored cars and light tanks with ease. A well-placed shot could penetrate the side of a Sherman tank. The Puma crews were aware of this capability. This knowledge became their undoing. The command issued a strict directive. Reconnaissance vehicles must never engage in combat. The task of the Puma was to observe and report. It was not built to hunt. However, the machine itself provoked the crews to violate orders. Why did the crews ignore the rules? They were soldiers trained for aggression, but the presence of a tank-killing gun made them feel invincible. Historians later recorded the pattern. Powerful weaponry tempted crews to fight rather than scout. Inside the cramped turret sat 4 men: the commander, the gunner, the driver, and the radio operator. The air was thick with the smell of oil and sweat. They watched the enemy through their sights. They knew they had the power to kill. Many succumbed to the urge to pull the trigger. Events accelerated. June 8, 1944. 2 days had passed since the Allied landings in Normandy. Panzer Division Lehr received orders to move toward the coast. Dust clouds rose from the columns. The armored cars of the reconnaissance battalion led the way. 26 Puma vehicles moved at the head of the force. They were commanded by combat veterans. There was no turning back. Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerling commanded the division. He knew the exact value of his scouts. Without his Pumas, the entire division was blind. The armored cars were his primary eyes on the battlefield. During the initial chaos of the invasion, the crews ignored the panic. They followed their drills. These men slipped between Allied positions and recorded every movement. They mapped enemy columns and located hidden artillery batteries. Coordinates were transmitted instantly over the radio. The tactics were old but effective. They followed pre-war instructions written by Heinz Guderian himself. During the day, the scouts remained motionless. They used thickets, ruins, or any cover to hide the silhouette of the eight-wheeled vehicles. At night, the Pumas moved. They became shadows on the roads of Normandy. The company only gathered in full force for two reasons. One was pursuing a retreating enemy. The other was covering a desperate withdrawal. Most of the time, the vehicles operated alone. They were ghosts on the edge of the horizon. Inside the steel hull, four men faced a constant test of nerves. The commander pressed binoculars to his face. He watched the turret rotate slowly. His eyes scanned the tree line for any sign of movement. The gunner did not look away from the sights. His finger rested on the trigger. One twitch would send a shell downrange. The engine was the only sound. The driver listened to the mechanical rhythm. He prayed the pistons would not seize at a critical moment. In the back, the radio operator watched the rear. He sat at a second set of controls. If an ambush began, he was ready to take over and drive the vehicle backward at full speed. There was no room for error. One mistake meant a fiery death inside a metal box. The mission continued. August 1944. The metal met metal. The Sd.Kfz 234/2. Puma's 50mm gun was a shock for Allied patrols. British and American columns expected light scouts armed with 20mm machine guns. Instead, they faced a medium tank cannon on wheels. One direct hit could split an armored car in two. The encounters often ended in burning wrecks and dead crews. But the Puma's greatest strength was not its firepower. It was its ability to vanish. The situation became too hot. Enemy fire intensified. This was the moment the crew followed their training. The vehicle did not turn around to flee. The radio operator sat at the rear control station and took the wheel. He drove the car backward at full speed. This move kept the thickest armor and the turret facing the danger. The thin, vulnerable sides remained hidden, 85 kilometers per hour. That was the speed of the Puma in reverse. The turret stayed locked on the target while the wheels spun. It was not a panicked retreat. It was a cold, ruthless calculation. The scout gave ground only to survive and report. But there was a predator the Puma could not outrun. This enemy did not use roads or hide behind Normandy hedgerows. It struck from the clouds. The summer of 1944 arrived. The sky belonged to the Allies. P-47 Thunderbolts, Hawker Typhoons, and P-51 Mustangs filled the air. They patrolled every road. They watched every intersection. They dived on every grove of trees capable of hiding a vehicle. The difference was the steel. A heavy tank could survive a strafing run. Its thick plates turned bullets into sparks. For the Puma, the air was a death trap. 8 millimeters of side armor, a thin turret roof. A single burst from a heavy machine gun or a rocket strike did not just damage the car, it turned the Puma into a coffin. There was no escape. Total disaster. Shrapnel and 20mm shells ripped through the thin plating, transforming the vehicle into a steel coffin. The tactic of stealth failed. It worked against infantry, but it was useless against aerial observers. A pilot at 1,000 meters saw what a soldier on the ground missed. He saw the dusty trail on a country road. He spotted the unusual shadow under the trees. He caught the sun glancing off the glass of a gun sight. August 1944. The Panzer Lehr Division was trapped in the Falaise pocket. The footage from those days shows one thing: chaos. Roads were clogged with burning trucks and twisted metal. The air was thick with the black smoke of diesel fires. Above the smoke, the constant hum of Allied radial engines filled the sky. For the Puma crews, this was the ultimate ordeal. At first glance, an ideal scout, but in reality, a trapped target. The very qualities that made the vehicle elite now worked against it. Speed meant nothing on roads blocked by debris and dead horses. Maneuverability provided no help when the horizon was closed. Thin armor offered zero protection against heavy machine guns firing from the clouds. Events accelerated. The cauldron finally closed. General Byerland began the grim task of counting the survivors. The scale of the destruction was absolute. Of the division's 109 tanks, only 20 survived. Of the 26 armored cars, 8 remained. Why did the lighter vehicles fare better? It seemed impossible. But the numbers revealed a hard fact. 18% of the tanks survived compared to 31% of the armored cars. Even in the hell of the pocket, the philosophy of retreat and stealth gave scouts a better chance than thick steel gave the tankers. But for the Puma itself, the road ended here. The factories could no longer keep up with the losses. In September 1944, production of the Puma officially ceased. The era of the heavy scout was over. January 1945. The factories went silent. The industrial heart of the Third Reich stopped beating. The luxury of complex engineering was over. Manufacturing a single vehicle across 5 different locations became an impossible task. The Puma was too expensive. The assembly line stopped. Instead, the military demanded the simplified 234/1. It featured an open turret and a small 20mm cannon. It was cheaper to build, it was simpler to maintain, but it was significantly weaker in a fight. How did the remaining Pumas perform? They fought until the metal screamed. The maps showed the collapse: Pomerania, East Prussia. The front lines moved west every day. March 1945. The last survivors of the 7th Panzer Division reached Danzig. The engines roared as the vehicles covered the retreat of thousands of refugees. Artillery shells impacted the frozen ground. Some crews refused to quit. They drove all the way to Berlin. They fought in the rubble of the capital. The war ended in May. Then, a strange fact emerged. Not a single 234/2 Puma had survived. Out of 101 vehicles built, the count was 0. Why did they all vanish? At first glance, they were just machines, but in reality, they were primary targets. Every single one was burned in an ambush, cut apart for scrap metal, or abandoned in the mud of a nameless forest. They disappeared into the chaos of the final collapse. The footage from global museums shows a different story. Relatives of the Puma still exist. In Bovington, United Kingdom, a 234/3 sights under the lights. In Munster, Germany, and Aberdeen, USA, visitors can touch the heavy armor of the 234/4. But the original Puma is gone. It is a ghost of history. It exists only in grainy black and white photographs and captured German documents. Events accelerated, but the machine could not keep up. Despite the total physical destruction of the fleet, the ideas survived. The design concepts did not die in the ruins of Berlin. The engineers had created a blueprint for the future. The story of the Steel Ghost ended there. 1945. Allied engineers dismantled the captured machines piece by piece. The technical data shocked them. This was the Sd.Kfz 234, known as the Puma. It featured 2 separate driver stations, 8 steerable wheels, a high-performance air-cooled diesel engine. The vehicle could travel backward as fast as it moved forward. In the mid-40s, these specs were decades ahead of the competition. 30 years passed. The year was 1975. The West German Bundeswehr officially commissioned the Spähpanzer Lux. The reconnaissance vehicle looked familiar. It had 8 wheels and 2 driver positions for instant reversals. It was the direct mechanical descendant of the Puma. The lineage was unmistakable. Look at modern military hardware today. Most heavy reconnaissance platforms utilize the 8x8 layout. The Italian Centauro, the American LAV-25, the Russian BTR-82. These machines are global standards. But why does this specific design dominate the battlefield? At first glance, modern innovation, but in reality, a legacy of the Third Reich. Every one of these vehicles carries the DNA of a project born in 1940, 6 years in prison. That was the price Hans Ledwinka paid after the war. He did not design shells or landmines, he built engines. But the court saw no difference. He had worked for the regime. He had no other choice. It did not matter. The gates of the prison closed behind him, but his engineering outlived his ruined reputation. The Tatra 512 engine did not disappear with the fall of the Reich. It remained the heart of the Tatra 111 series trucks. These heavy vehicles hauled cargo across the roads of a rebuilding Europe until 1962. An engine born for the invasion of the East spent 20 years serving the peace. The Puma was the most advanced armored vehicle of World War II. At the same time, it was perhaps the most useless. Only 101 units ever left the factory. This handful of machines could not tilt the scales of global conflict. They could not stop the massive armadas of Shermans and T-34s. They could not prevent Allied fighters from seizing total control of the sky. But these 101 vehicles achieved something else. They redefined the concept of the scout. A soldier is not protected by thick plates of steel. He is protected by the ability to vanish. The camera shows the vehicle's profile, low, sleek, and built for speed. Its value is not found in the caliber of its gun. Its value lies in seeing the enemy and returning with the report. Puma crews understood this reality better than anyone. They knew their thin metal skin offered no protection against a tank shell or heavy shrapnel. The sound of an incoming round meant certain death. Because they accepted this, they survived in sectors where heavy tankers died by the thousands. This was the primary lesson of the Puma. Heavy armor is often a trap. Sometimes the best defense is the ability to leave the area before the trap closes. The scout must face the enemy at full speed and then disappear. This story ended in the ruins of Berlin, but the doctrine of the Light Scout lived on.